Hi everyone, I'm Scott Davenport and welcome to ON1 Inspiration. It's great to be back to share another photo with you. If you're not familiar with my work, I'm a landscape photographer, workshop instructor, and photo educator based in San Diego, California. Although the photo I'm going to share with you today is far from San Diego. I took this photo on the coast of Japan. And why I wanted to share it with you is it made me think that this is a situation that I think many of us are in when we go and travel. I was in this region of the country for a few days, and there were these great rocks along the coast there, and I wanted to take the beautiful sunrise photo. I had the sun coming up behind the rocks, lighting up the sky, and well, that didn't happen. I actually dealt with a fair amount of rain, and each time I glanced out the window and looked up at the skies, they were kind of gray and cloudy and not very inspiring. But my final morning there, I still got up early, went out with the camera. It was drizzling, it was raining on me, but I stuck with it. And as it turned out, the sky didn't light up, but it started to form interesting textures and patterns and clouds. And I guess the moral is to get out there with your camera, even if the skies or the weather conditions aren't looking great, they can turn great. And I knew when I took this photo, I'd be able to bring it into ON1 and really make something special out of it, different than what I had envisioned with a gorgeous sunrise and a colorful sky, but a great photo nonetheless. So let's dive into ON1 Photo RAW and get started. So here is my RAW photo, straight out of the camera. This is from a Sony A7R, shooting 24-70, pretty typical focal range. And as you can see, I didn't get the color, but the sky became very interesting. And so a quick image assessment here. What I want to do is bring out some of the details in the rocks, certainly some of the details in the sky, but this area of the photo right here, this quickly became my favorite rock on this piece of the Japanese coast. So I want to draw your eye here and have everything else support this. So let's start with our basic processing. The lens corrections and the details, although turned on by default, are not doing anything, and that's fine. Let's collapse this so we have a little more real estate on the screen. The very first thing I want to make sure is I have a level horizon. So let's get the crop tool, choose our level, and just draw a little straight line right across the horizon edge. There we go, and apply that. Next is to check for any dust spots, and I will do that by taking the haze slider in tone and color and adding a bunch of haze, and just quickly looking around to see if there's any sensor dust or spots or things that can be construed as a spot. These look okay. Something else that can help is taking, where's my saturation slider? There we go. Taking that all the way down and making this black and white, just to see if I see any other spots. This looks pretty good. I really don't see any problems here. So that's great. We'll return that to normal. The exposure overall is pretty good. Looking at the histogram, I've got a little tiny gap at the end where a couple of the spectral highlights are missing. I'm going to inch up the exposure just a little bit, just so that histogram touches the edge there. Next, I'm going to adjust the black and white point with the black slider. If I press the J key down, we can see where the clipping is happening, and so I want to have just before we start to clip. So that -5 value there, and then for the white slider, we'll do the same thing. Press and hold the J key, and we'll start to see where we have any clipping. Actually, I can push that really far, but you know what? I don't want to push it that far because I'm losing the detail up in the sky. So we're going to keep that white point just a little bit raised. It's a little basic contrast for the overall scene. I will do more contrast work in effects because I cannot get myself enough of dynamic contrast. This will just be a little nudge to help the baseline that we'll work with when we get into effects. Raise the shadows some so we can get that foreground showing up. Now I'm going to raise it kind of a healthy amount because processing, especially when I start to add things like contrast or any vignetting at the end, that's going to darken the image. So we'll open up the shadows pretty far there. I'll rein in the highlights some. They don't need too much. They're looking pretty good. Around there's looking good. And I'm just watching the preview window as I adjust this. Now the image right now is still looking really flat, but we're only just getting started. I think the last thing I'll do before going into effects to really get some style is hit the auto button, see if it detects any type of color cast. It gave a slightly cooling, a bit of a tint to the image. Let me see if that's really any different. I can see it slightly reducing the warmth on the rocks, and that's all right. I'm actually already thinking about taking this into a black and white direction because there is not a lot of color in this scene, but there is some great texture, and yeah, I think that's what we're going to do. We're going to go in the black and white direction. Now let's move over into effects and start with some of our stylization. I'm going to start with contrast. I want to add some dynamic contrast here. Now this is for like the scene overall, and that's pretty good. That's pretty nice, where it's getting a nice amount of detail into the sky as well as the rocks. It's a bit much on the foreground. I don't want to draw attention down here. Remember, I want to draw attention to this rock. So let's get a masking bug. And let's take the opacity of that bug down to 40-ish%, something like that. And drop it on the scene. And let me rotate that around. So now we are masking away from the foreground. So notice before the contrast, after, and there's some contrast being added to the foreground, but not the full strength. So that's helping to keep the eyes looking up at the rocks and the sky, because our eyes are going to latch on to things that have sharper contrast, sharper edges, generally look more in focus. Actually, I'm going to add a second dose of dynamic contrast, and this one not at full strength. For now, we'll keep it pumped up so we can see everything. But I want to get more drama going on in the sky and these rocks, but certainly nothing in the foreground here. So let's again get our masking bug. We'll drop that. I'm going to put that all the way up to the top though, 100%. So I'm not adding any additional contrast here. If I press the O key, we can see this is where we're masking right now. And I'm also going to back off some of the contrast, the second contrast from these rocks. So let's get our masking brush and an opacity of 38. That's it. That's fine. I'm going to turn on the perfect brush so that I have edge detection. Make my brush a little bit big. Whoops, wrong key there. That was my mask. There's my brush size. And I'll just kind of sweep through the rocks. Actually, let me turn on the mask so we can see what we're getting here. We're kind of taking it away from that rock. Do here, here, and here. And I realize that I've got my mask inverted. I need to invert that mask. There we go. That's much better. Oh, I didn't notice that before. How could I have not noticed that? Okay, now my sky's popping, and I've got my rocks looking good. The foreground is clean. Let's dial back the strength of this, though. This was way too much. So I'm watching the sky as I do this, kind of just inching it up to get some more punch in the clouds. I don't want to go too far because then I'll start to introduce kind of a grainy pattern into the clouds because the contrast will be looking for edges to exaggerate. And I just want it a little bit extra. So before that one and after. That's looking really nice. We're going to stick there. Turns out to be 44%. The number is not important. It's the look that we're after. All right, now let's turn this toward black and white. So we'll go back to our filters. We'll add a black and white filter. And that already looks really nice. I'm going to hit auto for the color response and let the sliders get adjusted based on the tones there. If I do an undo before that and after, we get a little more of a separation where this was, orange, that's becoming brighter, and the other areas are becoming darker. That's some good contrast there. One thing I want to turn off is the film grain. I'm not a fan of film grain for my landscape work. I like to just keep it as smooth as possible. Go to great lengths to try to shoot at ISO 100. I don't want to be adding grain for this type of shot. Okay, sanity check here. So how are we doing toward my initial goal of trying to accentuate and draw the eye here? Looking pretty good as far as, the detail in the sky is nice. Detail in the rocks, good. I think we may amp that up a little bit. But I still need to start drawing the eye here. This foreground's become a little bit bright. This was, an orangey tone, similar to this little sun, bit of sunrise that was happening there. And so converting to black and white, you can see that, the orange yellows have gotten very bright. So let's tone down the foreground, and we can do that with a local adjustment. I'll just start with the darken preset, exposures there, and we'll get our local masking bug, drop that on the scene, rotate it around so we are darkening the foreground. And as I look at this, I think I'm also going to paint some of this darkening into the rocks as well. This will help to play up the difference. You know, this was the shady side of the rocks, and the sun, if it were to come up, would have risen behind the rocks. So I don't make them too bright. Let's get our local brush. We still have it at 40% or so. We're painting in, so that's good. And so we're going to paint in a little of this dark adjustment, this exposure adjustment. Let's go over here, quickly go through these spots. I'll turn the mask on with the O key so we can see that the edge detection is doing a very good job of keeping this within the rocks, unless of course I'm sloppy with my brush stroke. That's something actually I can point out here. Notice that if I keep my plus on these rocks, everything's fine. If I drift into the ocean, then I'm going to get a different mask, and I don't want to do that. So right through there, that's looking pretty good. Yeah, I like that. Nice darker rocks. Those are already starting to jump out more. I think also I'm going to take the detail slider down a little bit. So this is going to take the detail particularly out of the foreground. So let me reset that here for a second. Look at there's bits of grain and pattern in here. As I reduce detail, if I go really far, we'll see that get, completely blurry and muddy, and we don't want that. But just edging it off a little bit. That's one more visual cue where this is a little bit softer, this is a little bit sharper. I'm going to draw your eye here. Now, as I look at this, I want to add more contrast back in to these rocks. Recall in the filters, the second dynamic contrast we added. We did some painting work. Put the mask on there. Looks like I've got a stray mask. Let's go ahead and fill that back in. There we go. But we had painted away some of that contrast from the rocks. I think I want to return that. So let's get my brush down to 40-ish, something like that. Let me turn off the mask. I've got it set to plus. I will turn on the perfect brush. I'm going to use Command or Control R, and you can see that turns on my perfect brush. And let's paint that contrast back in. So this is a kind of not unusual for post-processing. You try some things out, and as you get farther into your processing, you can go back and revisit it. And one of the things that is fantastic about ON1 Photo is I can change any filter anywhere in the stack at any time, and I can still see everything else I've done. So I'm going and revisiting this contrast in the middle of my filter stack. I don't have to turn off the black and white. I don't have to turn off the local adjustments. I don't have to turn off the develop settings. So I can see everything right away. So that's better. That's nice. All right, now let's really draw the eye down to that rock. We're going to add a vignette. I'll tap my filter on the top so I can add the vignette to the top of the stack. And how I like to work with vignettes is I'll take the feather all the way down and take the brightness down a whole bunch. This is, way too much, of course. But this lets me see what kind of shape we have and where it's going to affect. And so I'm going to make this a kind of an oval shape. Actually, I think right about where it was pretty good. We'll bring the size down more. And I'll use this crosshairs tool. So I can now click and drag around here, and I can center it right on where I want you to see. Then I'll take the feather back out, right? We'll feather that out, and we can start to readjust the brightness. And so I don't want to get too dark, but I want to be a pretty healthy amount of darkness there. So that looks pretty nice. Let's see before that vignette and after. Yeah, definitely drawing in. I'm going to open that up, maybe open up the size a little bit more. So we'll get a little more of a natural looking glow from the brightness there. And I think the next thing to do is going to be a similar idea to the vignette, but we're going to do it with detail. So we'll grab a local adjustment to do that. Switch over to local adjustments and add a new layer, so a new adjustment. And I'm going to use the local adjustment masking bug with the center shape. So this means put the changes in the center. Now right now I've just clicked that on there. First thing we'll do is size this up. We'll get really tight on our subject here, our main rock. And I'm going to give it quite a healthy feather. Now right now it's adjusting exposure. I don't want exposure. I'm going to turn that off, but I want a detail. So I'm going to bring the detail up. Also bring the contrast up a little bit too. So this is really focused on inside the shape here. If I press the O key, we can see the overlay. So this is where a lot of that focused change is happening, and then it starts to feather out from there, right? So before that local adjustment and after, subtle change. Let me really crank this up so you can see it on the video here. So before and after. So that's much more pronounced. I'll back that off some because I don't want it to be too crunchy. And if I add too much contrast there, I run the risk of creating a halo around the edge of this rock, and I don't want to do that. Now, the other thing I don't want to do is I don't want to have that detail and that contrast being added in the foreground, right? We went to some expense here to do some masking to remove that, and now this shape is adding it back. I can add another gradient, and this one I can change the shape, or sorry, gradient. I can change the shape to gradient. I can add another bug. Now, let's position that. I'm going to press the O key so we can see what's going on, right? And I'll rotate that around. You can see where it's getting darker. I'm removing the effect, so I'm going to increase the opacity all the way up. And so I'm kind of creating this this like semi-cone shape here. O key there. I can position this wherever I need it to, right about here. So that's eliminating the contrast add in the foreground, but I'm keeping the center shape, that oval right here. And so the net result, before and after, it's a subtle change, but it's effective, and it's really drawing the eye right into that rock. I think perhaps a final tweak is going to be raising the highlights just a little bit inside this area here. So one more visual cue for our eyes to be drawn to brighter parts of the scene and coming in toward this rock. Now, one final thing. I'm going to return back to develop, and I'm going to double check those shadow settings now. Recall we opened the shadows up a bit. What if I open them up a little bit more? Is that doing anything for me? You know, I like it slightly more open. Let me see before and after. You know, one more subtle change. I think it looks a little more natural. So I'm going to stick with that final setting. So let's recap everything that we've done. We started with the original photo, had some interesting clouds, and some details that may have been hidden that needed to coax out. In develop, we straightened out the photo, did the basic adjustments, and get the exposure corrected. We moved into effects and added contrast to show those layers of clouds and go into a black and white version of the photo. And finally, we used a vignette and some local adjustments to draw the eye toward my main subject of the photo. I think the before and after transformation of this photo is pretty dramatic, pretty drastic, but I think the results are really nice. Well, once again, my name's Scott Davenport, and thank you for watching ON1 Inspiration.